So we now have plenty of time for questions. There are 2 roaming microphones, as you can see. So if you'd be able to raise your hand and wait for a microphone to be brought to you, that would be appreciated. I might also ask you keep your questions short and to the point. Any questions?
Thank you so much for that. That was really, really interesting. And I just wonder whether I could push you to talk about something from a more personal perspective.
Okay.
And particularly this issue of, perhaps having a family with a patient that, one might consider is dying, pushing for the medical vitalization kind of route, which can actually sometimes get very hard for staff in a hospital when they feel like a patient is even suffering more than they should.
Yeah.
I mean, how, from a personal perspective, do you work or help with that family to take them around to your point of view?
Yeah.
Assuming that, they are Christian or perhaps have that kind of background.
Okay, yeah, so, all right, so that last complication, which is good, it's good. I might respond in different ways depending upon a particular complication, but great question, and thank you for it. So I would say in kind of clinical spaces when this emerges, this is where, first of all, I understand exactly the point you're making. I'll often try to be careful of thinking about it as trying to turn them to my point of view. In some ways, I want to be very careful with that just because, everybody has her or his own ways of thinking about these issues, and we also want to allow for a particular kind of freedom and agency being expressed. The reality is that these families have to live with these decisions long after we're off the scene and forgotten about the case and so on and so forth. And so one of the things we try to do is to help folks think, okay, what is it that you're really getting at? So sometimes these phrases of we're not wanting to play God or we just want to kind of continue on, I think it's important to kind of probe a little bit and to ask questions, exactly what is your concern, right? What is it that you're trying to accomplish? And then kind of just walk with them, journey with them to say, okay, is this the best way to accomplish this? Sometimes they'll say, well, I don't want to give up on my loved one. It's like, yeah, got it. And so what do you mean by giving up on them? Well, we don't, the doctor says nothing more they can do. We push pretty hard to say, try not to say that, right? Say that, look, curative treatments, not really working, not doing the job. We need to turn our attention to a different kind of care for your loved one, right? That's a very different message than, well, there's nothing more that we can do, right? For, someone who finds herself or himself in these situations. Now, for those who are Christians, right, when I'm maybe not working, well, actually, I've done this when maybe working as an agent of the systems, working with ethics committees. I often try to get at, if they raise kind of the religious content, especially Christian tradition, I just kind of probe and help them think about their resources and kind of trace out the implications of that. And it takes time. Sometimes people really know that they have to make these hard decisions, but they just need help kind of getting there. And sometimes you have to exercise, I think, a particular kind of patience when you navigate those. I saw one of my colleagues when I was working as hospice medical director, who also is a person of faith, and I saw him do something brilliantly, and it was just so impressive to me. And he was working with a family situation very similar to what you described, and they invoked, kind of the religious kind of God piece, and kind of think about this. And he just pulls up a chair and he just sits down, right? Eye level with everyone, and talks. Says, "So, do you believe in a God that has certain characteristics and all this?" They say, "Yeah." And then he just basically said, "I believe in that kind of a God too. And if there was this miracle forthcoming, I think the same kind of God that we believe in doesn't need all of this stuff to do what God's going to do." Because they were saying, well, we can accept it if we just kind of, and he just kind of graciously walked with them. And oftentimes that's what was needed for people to feel like they have been heard, to journey with them, to walk with them. And so there are no algorithms, right, that one can employ. It's just about kind of getting in with them, living life, listening, trying to help them think through their values, and if they do lay claim to certain theological resources, to help them think through the implications of that. That's kind of in the moment, but then what we're also championing is that theological education for those who are being trained to do pastoral or chaplaincy work and so on and so forth. We are encouraging divinity schools and seminaries to require a course on these issues. If nothing else, you're certainly going to deal with some of this stuff, right? And if you just leave it to kind of electives or so on and so forth, students may not take advantage of it, but yet they're going to be confronted with these kinds of issues. And so we are trying to prepare folks long before the crisis moment. So churches, we're trying to think of creative ways to get this involved in churches. We talk about helping people learn how to live well. We don't talk a lot about helping people to die well, right, to the glory of God. We need to do that in our churches. We need to preach about it. We need to model it with all of these theological, kind of categories that we have. So, and pardon this military metaphor, and I'll say this and move on. A dear friend of mine, when I was in college, he was in the military before coming to college, so he was a little older than some of us, and we often used to say that he was wise beyond his years. And so he used to have this military metaphor that he would share with me when he thought I needed it. And I heard exactly what he was saying when he would say these different things for other issues in my life, right? And so he would say, he called me Brother Pat. He said, Brother Pat, he said, it's much more difficult to prepare for war if you hear the tanks coming down the road, right? So if you feel the trembling of the tanks, so it's a little late to prepare for war. And so, and I got it, right? He was saying, well, no, look, I've got to work on some of these things long before we get to the moment. I think with these questions, right, medicalized dying, what it means to die well, we've got to start sooner, right? We've got to start talking about this being as part of our liturgy and so on and so forth, our theological education, training, so that we are better equipped to deal with those moments, yeah. So I hope that's somewhat helpful. So.
Thank you very much. I wonder if I could take you back to something you said right at the beginning and question it quite seriously. You said that your understanding is in the Christian tradition, death is seen as unnatural. I would very strongly challenge that because it seems to me that there is a huge biblical tradition of seeing as death as natural and indeed welcoming death as a friend. I mean, just think of Jesus' words, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it dies, it brings forth much fruit. And the whole understanding that I would get from Christianity is that death is essential to life and is the precursor to life. What about Francis of the Canticle of the Creatures, O thou most kind and gentle death? I would have thought you could completely reverse what you say and say that actually in the Christian tradition, death is natural and to be welcomed as a friend, and that much of what you're worried about is because we are misinterpreting that tradition with the kind of secular medical view that you took. I'd just be interested in how you'd react to that.
Thank you so much for that, and that gives me an opportunity to try to kind of nuance something, and you're absolutely right. So I do take that. So I was trying to, a little bit earlier, without getting into a lot of the details, because I was trying to go to something else, I was trying to say that there is this linkage between like sin and death in a particular kind of way, and I was trying to kind of gesture towards this idea of, yes, death is part of Christian tradition, we do have this, but there seems to be some at least my kind of thinking about these issues, there's something that's significant about the experience of death, right, in relationship to notions of sin and fallenness, right? Now, we may have to continue working out the theological categories and how we articulate that. What I was really trying to get at is, and yes, I didn't state it nearly as clearly as I should have there, but the point I was trying to get at, there was this link between sin and death, where there's something about death that should be resisted in a way, right? I mean, in terms of if we have the opportunity to, take care of our bodies, our health, and so on and so forth, that we should try to be good stewards of that, or if there's reasonable medical treatment, perhaps that's available, that can sustain our lives, right? So that's what I was trying to get at, that there's something that we should do to preserve this gift that we have been given, in terms of, as Paul Rand, we talk about life as being a gift and a trust. So I do take your point. I think your point is well taken, but I was just trying to highlight this connection with something about the nature and the tone of death is different with this connection of sin and fallenness. And so, and of course, people could disagree and kind of quibble about that, but that's just my understanding of the aspects of tradition I was trying to kind of capture and get at. And so that other side of the tension may actually, as you mentioned, could be, resolved or something along that line, but I just was trying to capture that a little bit. So thank you for that. And,
Hey, thank you, Patrick.
Sure.
Were you familiar with the Alfie Evans case over here?
I'm sorry, which one?
The Alfie Evans case of the toddler who was he had a terminal illness, and his parents wanted to prolong his life, but then the courts ordered the doctors not to give him treatment. They wanted to take him overseas. There was all this furor there was debate about it, and I saw debate from people in the U.S. as well, especially Christians got in on the debate. And I don't know if you saw any of this, but we're just up in arms saying, no, you've got to let the parent, well, of course you've got to let the parents have their choice. But also fear about not giving this child the care that he needed, even though he had, I'm just looking at this here, he had a terminal degenerative neurological condition that was mysterious. And the courts prevailed, and then the child died. And I guess I'm wondering, and again, I don't know how familiar you were with this case, so this may be an unfair question, but in just thinking about the reactions, and especially the Christian reactions, would this fall under, how would you respond? If the courts came and said, can you give us your expert advice, how would you respond to this case from a sanctity or inviolability of life position? And were some of the staunch reactions to this case, did they come out of medical vitalism, would you say?
Yeah, okay, so I'm not as familiar with all of the intimate details of the case, right? And so commenting on a particular case without having all of the readily available information about the case can be extremely dangerous, right? Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, that many, moral judgments often turn on non-moral facts, right? So the judgments that we make about these decisions often depends on all this stuff that was going on. So let me just kind of speak in general terms with the danger of perhaps missing something with respect to this particular case. So look, with the whole idea of sanctity of life, I would just say this, from this particular vantage point, it plays a framing role, right? It's just saying, hey, look, it's not required that caring for someone at the end of life is doing any and everything regardless of any other considerations, that we do have to take all of these things into consideration in terms of making particular kinds of decisions. And as I have seen cases similar to this kind of unfold in the United States, in some of the medical spaces where I've been, on ethics committees, right, and having the conversations and writing the reports, and then especially hearing some of the responses from Christians, I want to be careful here, right? I do think we have to be careful commenting on these issues from afar, right? It's just, my sense is that I want to listen very carefully as to how the objections were being made, right? And if the assumption is the primary impetus of something like a kind of medical violence view, then I want to push back and challenge that, right? Now, that is not to say, therefore, let the courts prevail or you should just cease all treatment, right? So just to say that you reject medical violence doesn't mean, therefore, the decision is already made. It just means that it puts into kind of a particular frame of reference the kind of options by which, the options now that you have to make a decision about, right? So it's not that it excludes anything, it actually includes, hey, this is an option. And I do think that, unfortunately, speaking very generally, again, and dangerously, that some Christian communities misunderstand the sanctity of life as I've tried to think about it here and actually end up embracing a vitalism. I think that some of us, have not been careful in thinking through clear distinctions so that when others are making arguments, we actually accept the assumptions and the premises of those arguments. So something like Helmut Kusay, I've shared this with many others and other philosophers who are making similar arguments. I just share it with theology students, right? And many of them accept the premises, right? And then end up either taking all of these in or rejecting them all, and so we kind of work through it. I think that's a mistake, right? In some ways, I think you have to think more carefully about that. So my sense is, based on the way you've described it, that some of the assumptions may actually be vitalistic assumptions. because I think we have to acknowledge the fact that, look, there is a time to die. These are very difficult issues, and I'm a huge advocate of palliative care, right? And I think that we've allowed the extremes to kind of take over the options where either you're doing all this aggressive stuff or you're just kind of just shutting it down and not doing anything. I think you can do infant palliative care very well, have meaningful experiences for the family and also the professional care team who are involved in those conversations as well. So, yeah. Sorry, Liz, I couldn't do any more for you on that. So, others here.
Thank you very much. I've found your talk very inspiring indeed. I'm wondering how you would advise somebody within the, perhaps particularly within the Christian faith tradition, when you're working with people at end of life who either have no faith or a completely different tradition. Because, I mean, if I think about something like the way of the Buddha, for example, there wouldn't be any feeling of wanting to convert or comfort people within that tradition if they were outside of that tradition. But if you're the kind of Christian who is so filled with joy at your sense of everything that Christianity means for you, and also have that injunction from Jesus, go and do likewise, and tell people, etc. Then if you have somebody towards the end of their life who's perhaps feeling very vulnerable, or their family is, and they're pleading for help, that, to me, I would feel there might be a real split between really wanting to share that faith and that hope, and feeling that maybe one shouldn't because they're from somewhere else. And I just wonder how you'd sort of go about that kind of issue.
Okay, so it sounds like this issue of conversion, right? Or maybe Christians who were, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, also just to comfort through that without necessarily being full conversion.
Oh, yes, okay. So here, I mean, this is my approach, and I've had a lot of conversations with many colleagues who are in different, we may agree on this kind of broader framework, but we may disagree exactly how to kind of walk these waters here. But let me start in a couple of ways. One, I've had the privilege for a number of years teaching, at least in the medical school space prior to coming over to Duke, class entitled Theological and Religious Perspectives in Bioethics. And one of the things that we do in there, because there are a lot of students from different backgrounds, different faith traditions, no faith traditions, as well, and we would read some of the bioethics literature, religious bioethics from Buddhism, from Islam, from Roman Catholic traditions, Orthodox traditions, Protestant traditions, Hindu traditions, and it was interesting. So what we were really encouraging people to do is to say, hey, look, we need to encourage folks who are part of these various faith traditions to do a deep dive within their tradition, because oftentimes there are resources within these traditions to help them think about these problems. And so as I may think about a particular way of dealing with the Christian tradition and thinking about those issues, I've also encouraged some of our Muslim students and some of my Muslim friends, those who are professional colleagues in terms of Conference of Medicine and Religion, right, as they are thinking about how to think about these issues in a very kind of a thick way. So I think we first of all need to kind of encourage that in working with and kind of comforting families who may be of different traditions than my own. And what I've often encouraged folks to do, if they are steadfast, committed to that particular tradition, then I think it is our job. If you want to say that you are a Christian, want to bear witness, I want to say bear witness in an embodied expression, being the hands and the feet of Jesus, and just loving your neighbor and kind of caring for them and caring for them enough to journey with them, regardless of whatever decisions that they make in thinking about those kinds of issues. And the reason why this is important, because there are some practices at the end of life. For example, the way I frame this, there are some expressions of Islam, certain sects, where something like palliative sedation would not be appropriate, or in the North American context, some of the indigenous tribes, that would not be an option because they need to actually clear their bodies of any type of chemicals or spirits to prepare for their transition. Certain Islamic traditions suggest that this kind of sedation to unconsciousness, perhaps to the point of death, is not appropriate because the faithful there will not have an opportunity to do some of the rituals that are needed in terms of preparing for death and so on and so forth. So this particular framing has certainly been kind of a Christian one. Other traditions may come at different places. Now, for this kind of last case that you've kind of said that if somebody's not quite sure and kind of trying to navigate these waters, let me be clear that what I'm about to say is not kind of an appeal to a secular autonomy or anything along that line, but what it is to try to figure out what it is they value, right? What is it that they care about? How do they express and understand their spirituality and so on and so forth? And then how can you be present with them, in those moments? Now, what that looks like in concrete form, it takes, discernment, and you kind of trust, and you think about those waters. But again, I do think that of course, a lot of what I was saying is going to be tradition specific, obviously. But what I've tried to do is hold this up in various spaces as a model, right? By the way other traditions can think about these issues. And so I should probably stop there. And I'm not sure if I quite got at the essence of your question. Feel free to either come back or maybe at the afterwards you can push me a little bit more to in a way that you want me to. Okay, great. I think I see one more. Yeah. Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I'd like to ask a question about something you quoted from the end of your lecture. If indeed morality is a spiritual or perhaps a philosophical problem rather than a medical problem, my question is, so what is the next step, and where do we go with this? Is it just a private issue, or do you have any suggestions for whether it's actually feasible to systemically change how our society values are structured and how our healthcare system is structured, given how much people value sustaining life at the end of life through medicine?
Yes, very, very good question, and I appreciate this. And I was quoting Robert Fine there in that last kind of op-ed piece that he wrote from many years ago, and my kind of gloss on that would be that it's not only a medical problem, but also a spiritual problem. He says not a medical problem, but a spiritual problem. And some of that was kind of rhetorical because of the venue in which he was writing, right? So it was kind of rhetorical turn of phrase to kind of get at this idea that we have to be careful of technological fixes for something that may have a spiritual dimension to it, right? And so in that sense, I would not want to deny the medical aspect, but also highlight, as others say, this whole idea of a spiritual problem we face. And so I think what needs to happen, which is already happening in some quarters I'm really excited about, there have been a number of medical professionals and those who are working in the humanities, but also working in clinical spaces who have been raising these issues. There have been research projects. Again, people are, obviously maybe of different minds here and there, but just looking at the impact of this kind of broad umbrella term of spirituality. And some people don't like that, but it's like, well, what exactly is that? Well, okay. If we can come up with a kind of a definition, something that kind of captures these existential desires that people have that's often expressed in religion and so on and so forth, right? People are starting to identify that the role of spirituality actually can have beneficial health outcomes, right? And even if you have medical professionals who are maybe averse to religion and so on and so forth, the point that many people are trying to make, say, look, even if you yourself are not a spiritual person, or particularly religious, meaning the patients you work with are, right? Which means that in order to provide care, and if spirituality and religion does play this kind of role that many people think it does in people's lives, then we have to give some attention to it. And I do think that in the training of doctors, right? So in medical school, space medical education, which is happening, I know, in a number of institutions, that these questions are being raised. Doctors are starting to be more vocal by recognizing that there's only so much they can do, and the kinds of questions that they're getting from their patients exceeds the kind of the technical aspects of the medical profession in some ways. So I think we just have to continue having the conversations. If those empirical research programs are constructed carefully, and if it is correct, right, that there are these benefits, then we need to find creative ways to continue, these conversations, not be afraid to talk about this. I think it has to be done carefully, right? But I know in many of these spaces, we just interject it and we have people wrestle with it. Just one quick example, when I was teaching this particular course, Theological Religious Perspectives in Bioethics, a number of medical doctors who are in there, many of them don't have particular adherence to any faith. But what they recognized, they were saying, wait, some of the decisions that I think would be appropriate in certain situations, these religious traditions actually would affirm that as well. And so one of the things that they recognize is that sometimes they come in with this kind of confrontational model, right? That here's, medicine, scientific, and so on and so forth, religious bioethics, all these conversations are going to always kind of butt heads with what we're thinking, right? But they recognize you don't have to come in with this confrontational model, that as we're all in these spaces together, we're all trying to solve common problems and kind of reminding people that way, and whatever resources we have available to us to help with that endeavor, that I think we should welcome that, or those resources if it can indeed help. So many of us are trying to do this. I would encourage you to look at two things. One, the Conference on Medicine and Religion is an international conference, so people come from different parts of the world, medical doctors and those working in healthcare spaces come to this, where we wrestle and talk about these issues and what it may look like in the various institutions. And then also a shameless plug for our Theology, Medicine, and Culture program at Duke Divinity School, right, where we do have a number of medical doctors who work with the School of Medicine and really trying to reimagine what medicine looks like. And that's really the project, reimagining medicine, again, to make it more humanistic, pushing back from the technological driven pathway.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we have to draw to a close now. The time's run out, but there should hopefully be a drinks reception out in the foyer, so that will give you a chance to continue on the conversation there. But can we show one more sign of appreciation to Professor Smith?